it's a very wide field for authors to play in, and they take advantage of that, which is great for the readers, because if you get tired of one kind of theme, there's a million more to pick from. Like stars in the galaxy. Sci-fi fantasy is kind of a crazy section, because it's all purely speculative fiction. So you can go in a lot of different directions with that. There's sci-fi and fantasy, and then there's the sci-fi that blends into fantasy, and the fantasy that blends into sci-fi, and which is one of the reasons why I put them all together, because some authors straddle that line. They go both ways. The other great thing about sci-fi is the way that the authors can sort of couch ideas within, issues that might be too touchy to deal with in an everyday setting, or might be a little bit too raw. You can take them, create this other world, create this other planet, this other civilization and culture, and you put those ideas in there amongst the people that are telling the story, and you can talk about stuff. You're just looking at it at a slightly different angle, and it gives you perspective, which is great. It helps you grapple with major problems without agonizing over them so much. The characters are agonizing over them for you. You're watching it as it goes along, and you're thinking. You're allowed to think outside of the stream of action about these ideas, and it somehow works. So that's the other really exciting thing about sci-fi. Ursula K. Le Guin is a prime example of that. She excels at putting really challenging ideas into her books, like The Dispossessed, and allowing the reader to struggle with them through the characters. And it's a phenomenal thing, and I think people overlook that. Sci-fi and fantasy get stuck in these little genre niches, and people dismiss them. And the people who don't read them don't realize there's a lot of really good stuff going on there that they're missing out on. Sci-fi has a lot of little niche genres, like cyberpunk, where you think it's only this much, but over the years it just widens and widens and widens. Cyberpunk started out with a few different fellows, but the best known fellow is William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, which is the holy grail of cyberpunk. And now that's pushed even further. Richard Morgan's Takeshi Kovacs books are phenomenally good, and this all ties into the whole Blade Runner thing, which we can blame our little Philip K. Dick for. He started it all with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which seeded a million worlds. And I suppose in a lot of ways we can thank Isaac Asimov's I, Robot for starting us thinking about what makes a robot, what makes a human, what are we going to do when we eventually overstep our bounds and let the technology get ahead of us, which is, is right now is coming back to the forefront again. Stuff that was written decades ago is amazingly on topic still, because they were reaching ahead. They were thinking about what was going to happen and what might or might not go wrong or right. There's early sci-fi, and then there's proto-sci-fi. Like you can look at Mary Shelley, who she not only wrote Frankenstein, which is very much science fiction, as well as horror, mixed together. There's again one of those little straddling the line between two genres. Speculative fiction is great for that, but she also wrote post-apocalyptic fiction, which, at that era, who does that? But apparently she was. While other people were writing utopian novels for speculative fiction, she was getting dark. So there's that whole range of like the uber classic, the proto sci-fi, and then there's the good old stuff like Heinlein and Asimov and those guys that wrote for years and years and years. And we take a lot of that for granted now. But if you read something like Clarke's 2001, which a lot of people have either seen the movie or read the book, and the book was worked on at the same time they were working on the movie, so that's kind of an anomaly. But it's interesting because there is stuff in the book that isn't in the movie. Little subtleties, little nuances, little details. And the stuff he's talking about in that book, the newsreader he's using, it's a tablet. Like these guys were seeing stuff ahead. Like that is one of the most exciting things about sci-fi, is you're really trying to push your imagination, saying, what do I wish for? Or what do I see happening as a result of the coinciding of events and ideas and needs of the populace, and what will happen. And so science fiction often becomes science in the end, because it's the germs of ideas that scientists look at and say, oh my gosh, I want that to happen. How can I make that happen? Surely I can make this happen. You know, what needs to come together to get there? So the sci-fi writers were always living in the future. But sometimes we don't realize how far in the past they were working on the future. Decades ahead of time. The new authors they're working a lot still with slipstream dimensions, like how we're going to travel, how space travel, interdimensional travel is going to affect us. They're still chucking away at that. And they're talking about languages, because language is the basis of communication. And if we run into other cultures, how do we communicate? China Mieville's Embassy Town is an amazing book for both of those. It treads very lightly on the interdimensional travel, but the language element in it is phenomenal. You'll find yourself thinking about things you never thought about, stuff you took for granted, and we have to push our brains in that direction, because if we're going to talk to people on other worlds, if that ever happens, they're not us. We have to find a way. We can't take things for granted about language, even on our own planet, which is, again, the reflection of the real into the unreal. We make a lot of assumptions about what other people are thinking and why they're doing things, and we have no idea. So the new authors are treading a lot with that. They're also talking a lot about gender, and how people are treated because of their gender, and what would happen if you could change gender, or if we just simply dealt with it differently. And these are conversations that were started, decades ago by Samuel Delaney and a bunch of other people who were wondering what's going to happen. We've talked a lot about the serious stuff in sci-fi, but both sci-fi and fantasy also have a very fun element. Fantasy is often viewed as escapist literature for that reason. Sci-fi has that same element. How many of us started out reading sci-fi by picking up Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams? He's a phenomenally funny guy. He's sometimes dealing with very serious issues in his books, but because of the way he handles it, it's the most entertaining thing you've ever read. Christopher Moore is really great for that. Terry Pratchett has a huge following. People just gobble his books up for the same reason. They're fun. And then there's the fun of shoot-'em-up space opera stuff, like C.J. Cherry's Channer's series. Can't stop turning the pages because you want to know what's going to happen next. So there's plenty of serious sci-fi, but there's an awful lot of fun stuff too. It's a great way to keep yourself entertained. Basically, what I try to do with the sci-fi fantasy section is have as much of it on hand as I can. It's impossible to stock all of it. There's so much stuff that's come and gone out of print, or people just hang on to it. It makes it tough sometimes, but I do my best to cover all the bases so that, if you're missing the third book in whatever series, come on down, because it might be sitting on the shelf waiting for you. That book that you've been looking for 5 years. That one little lone spot that hasn't been checked off on your list. There's a lot of stuff here, and if we don't have it, there's probably something else that you'll be just as excited about. So there's always room to explore in the sci-fi fantasy section.